Sorry to keep you waiting for the afternoon session. I'm Peter Franklin, and I was a member of the Oxford Music faculty until a year ago when I retired. And I'm chairing this session, and the idea is we're going to give Professor Thielemann a little rest for a moment, although we hope he might want to respond at the end, and he's here. And so although each of these two sessions, if you're not here for both, they're each independent, so you don't have to be here for both sessions. If you are here for both sessions, they are really linked together, and we're a sort of warm-up act for the roundtable discussion, which will happen after the tea break. And there is tea, I'm told to tell you, for everyone who is here, whether or not you're staying for the second session. So I will be introducing my two colleagues as we get there. I'm going to begin with a few words about Regietheater. We boldly called this session Regietheater Revisited, and some of you may wonder if you've ever been there in the first place, to even want to revisit it. So I felt I should explain at the outset what Regietheater means. Some of you will know. But it's a compound word that the soft G announces the fact that the first part is really French in origin, and it links to a role in the theatre which Professor Thielemann was referring to just at the end this morning, the régisseur, French term that is sometimes translated as stage manager, but thereby hangs quite a tale. Now, the term has come to be used both positively and perhaps more obviously negatively, more often negatively, by critics in discussing what we would probably all want to call modern productions, in scare quotes, sometimes some of them more scary than others. And this, so the French part, the régisseur, it really takes us back into the 19th century, when in French Grand Theatre, one of those little technical interruptions. When French Grand Opera was in the 1830s in Paris, was doing wonderful things. It's the era of Meyerbeer and Rossini, and extraordinary theatrical pictures and dramatic events at the ends of operas with volcanoes erupting and people throwing themselves off cliffs and all sorts of dramatic things. And the régisseur, the régie, is really the group of people who are ancillary to what we normally would think of as the opera. And we tend to think of as an opera, in the way that we've been talking about it thus far, as something which exists in a score, and it involves music and words. And it's something that can be... is that going to stop? Oh, I'm sorry, it's a Windows code, right. And so if we think of an opera, if you've ever been to a concert performance of an opera, you're seeing something that we can call the opera, if you see Salome or Electra done in concert circumstances. But clearly, what we mean by opera, properly speaking, is something that takes place in a theatre, and there's a lot of other things going on. There's the whole business of the staging and the performance of the opera as a theatrical experience, which is more than just a musical experience, it's more than just a theatrical experience, it's a compound of all of those things. Now, the régisseur was therefore at one point, historically, in charge of all of those things that went on the stage, the sort of traffic management of where people were, where singers were, when the chorus came on, where they came from, all of those things, getting the scene painting done, or the scene erected, the set erected, and all the rest of it. We've had one or two references to Mahler, not all of them entirely positive. I will try and have a positive reference to Mahler. When Mahler, the great composer, as known to most of you, became director of the Vienna Court Opera in 1897, he found himself at a relatively conservative institution, although with extraordinarily high standards of musical performance, the Vienna Philharmonic playing in the pit. But he was up against what was then the régisseur, who was a man called Herr Stoll, Herr August Stoll. And Herr Stoll was a typical sort of 19th century régisseur, in that he was really what we would call probably a stage manager. He was the person responsible for everything that went on stage. But Mahler always said, when Herr Stoll is acting as a regisseur. I have to take over. I am the director. And so we have a sort of power struggle here. And what was going on was that Mahler, who began to want to do what we're going to be calling, as it were, Regietheater, he started appointing contemporary painters, the famous Alfred Roller in Vienna, a member of the Vienna Secession. And he said, I want you to come and design new sets for the opera. We've had these old sets for years and years and years, going on and on and on. I want opera to look different. I want it to be staged in a different way. What do you think we could do? One of the things that Roller said was, well, what about Fidelio, when all the prisoners come out of jail and they sing their great chorus towards the end of Fidelio? Rather than having them all massed on stage in a great phalanx, like a battalion of an army, why don't we have them creeping out one by one, dramatically, and appearing on stage? And Mahler said, oh yes, we can do that. So long as I've got 4, if I've got a quartet, then I can have 8 people, and then we can gradually build up. Yes, what a wonderful idea. It sounds much more dramatic. Herr Stoll said, oh no, he said, no, the Male Choral Society, there are 200 of them, and they're used to singing this chorus together. They all need to be there, and they process on during the third Lohengrin prelude, which Mahler, like many people, played at that crucial point in the middle of the last act. And so they would all assemble, and then they would sing the chorus. Mahler prevailed in the end. Now, that kind of power struggle is really what the modern regisseur who becomes the regie of Regietheater. So if you imagine someone like Mahler's Herr Stoll in Vienna becoming what we would now call the director, the power struggle moves in the other direction, whereas Mahler, who was called the director of the Hofoper, of the court opera in Vienna, could pull rank over Stoll. The modern director is someone who, as Professor Thielemann was saying this morning, has to be allowed to do what he or she wants to do. So the power shift has gone slightly the other way. Now, we're therefore left with Regietheater as a term that refers to modern productions of operas that are often known by the name of their producer or the director, rather than by the name of the composer. So we think of Schlingensief's Parsifal, or what would be another an example, Seller's Magic Flute, or something like that. We refer to the director as if it were the author of the production. Now, this of course is now getting us into the territory of Regietheater, where we might expect all sorts of things to happen that we would not normally expect to see happening in an opera that we thought we were familiar with. This is where the negative part of it comes in. And I want to allude briefly in these, I don't want to go on too long, but my introductory comments, I want to allude briefly to a book by David Levine, American academic who is interested in critical theory. And he wrote a book in 2007 called Unsettling Opera. And it's very much pro-Regietheater, very much for directors who want to unsettle us, the audience, who want to unsettle the tradition of operatic production. And he refers to a famous French theorist, Roland Barthes. I don't want to get too involved in all this, but he alludes to one of 2 essays that Barthes wrote around the year 1970. And the crucial essay that he refers to is called From Work to Text. And the idea is that the whole, basically David Levine is saying that musicology is behind the times, has not got to grips with opera, not as something that exists in a musical score, but as something that exists in the score and all of the other aspects of a live production of opera. So what David Levine wanted to do was to find ways of reading a production. And so he uses Barthes to say we think of it as a kind of text. All opera production is part of text. Now, what Barthes was really talking about when he says he wants to move from work to text is he wants to say, I don't want to be simply revering great works of the past and being told by my teachers in Paris or wherever it was how to read them and how to value them. I want to be freer. I want to move from this thing that we call work with a capital W, which we fall on our knees before, and I want to call it text and therefore let it take take its place in a wider community of texts, of theatrical texts. And he wanted to find ways of actually reading these texts which free us from this, as it were, cultural obsession with the work as something that has to be worshipped. And so you can see how we're moving towards productions that take place in strange locations. Salome taking place not in the palace, but as in a recent Covent Garden production, in the kitchens beneath the palace, with the walls covered full of hanging carcasses and blood on the tiles and all the rest of it. And of course there's a great deal more blood by the end of Salome, as you know. But surprising locations, the singers doing strange things and looking strange, and perhaps probably wearing modern costumes or not, certainly not trying to allude to the historical period. So textuality in opera production for David Levine frees us from obsession with the work. But my slight concern about this, which is the issue that I would want to raise at this stage before my colleagues make their presentations, is simply that he overlooks the other Barthes essay, which was called famously The Death of the Author. And that what Barthes there was talking about is in trying to free up the way he was going to deal with works of art of the past in the way that he was taught them, perhaps as a child. He wants to move from the work to the text, and he believes that the death of the author of the work simultaneously takes place with the birth of the reader. So what he wants to do is to free us all up to be readers of text, to say we can read things in our own way. We can find new meanings in them that are not simply the old meanings we always were told were there. So this sounds all rather liberal and wonderful. Now, my concern, my own worries, the sort of issues I want to raise at the beginning here, are that this concept that David Levine sets up is sort of divided in an odd way. Are we reading the opera as it existed in the score and in the libretto and so on and so forth? Or are we, and he wants to do both, I think, are we reading productions? Whatever is happening, we read the production as a live theatrical experience. And he sort of wants to do both. My concern is that the odd thing that happens is that in moving, as it were, from work to text in operatic production, we mysteriously reinvent the author. And so the dead Wagner, Mozart, Beethoven, or whoever it might be, who's now pushed in a little bit more into the background, is replaced by the director, who is yet another author who is reading the work for us, which seems to me potentially problematic in this whole sort of setup. And of course, historically, we've got to remember that the idea of the concert performable opera is itself a historical construct. In the 19th century, when Mahler arrived at the Vienna Court Opera in the 1890s, it was common to produce Wagner with huge cuts. Often the actual musical text would not be regarded as in any way fixed, but things would be inserted, things would be removed. Different singers liked to do different bits and maybe didn't want to do that bit, and so there would be cuts in the actual performance. You wouldn't hear the whole of Wagner. It was only during Mahler's reign that he, as a purist, said we've got to get all those cuts back because I want to hear the work that Wagner wrote. So you can see how the tension between Mahler and the regisseur is sort of set up there. So, in other words, whereas now a director will normally pretty much keep the musical text intact, but completely ignore all of the stage directions in the original score and so on. In the 19th century, it was often the other way around. The production would last for decades, and certainly, like the Parsifal at Bayreuth, went on for decade after decade after decade, same set and everything. But it was the actual musical text that was often more fluid in terms of the way it was treated in actual performance. Nowadays, we think of the musical work as something that sits there pretty securely, whereas it's the actual staging that is going to change and become surprising and is going to unsettle us in David Levine's sense. So my concern would simply be that we try not to see the work as a binary with the music plus the plot and the action on stage and the stage directions and all the rest of it, but as something which is as partly as what David Levine is trying to say, that we try to think of the opera as something that included all of those other things, and maybe we should also be reading the historical stage directions as much as we're reading the plot and we're reading the text and so on and so forth. So while I'm broadly supportive of this change in power between the director of the opera and the stage manager and so on, it seems to me there are sort of theoretical issues. Now, I want to leave those issues hanging in the air and move to the first of my two colleagues who are going to speak this afternoon. This is Professor Suzanne Aspden, currently a member of the Faculty of Music at Oxford, and you're going to speak from here. Initially,
okay.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. Her research interests are in 17th and 18th century opera, and I thought it would be a nice idea, since Barry Millington, who I will introduce formally in a moment, is going to talk about Wagner, bring us back to really the main topic of our sessions this week. I thought it'd be interesting to have somebody talking about earlier opera in relation to the modern director and the appalling or wonderful things that they do with these historical texts. So, as I say, Suzanne is a specialist on 17th and 18th century opera. Her book, The Rival Sirens: Performance and Identity, came out in 2013 from CUP. And I think, without further ado, I will hand over to Suzanne. She's heroically with us today. She's in fact in two conferences simultaneously. There's another conference going on in Christchurch, sort of as we speak, which Suzanne is giving a keynote speech in tomorrow. So we're very grateful for you to join us this afternoon, Suzanne. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. I have the mud on my boots to prove it. The trekking back and forth. And thank you for inviting me to speak this afternoon. I'm a little bit of a fish out of water because obviously your focus is mainly on the 19th and early 20th centuries, I think.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And but as Peter said, he thought it might be interesting, a way of sort of fueling further discussion to look back to the 17th and 18th centuries. And perhaps apposite for this afternoon's discussion, because it seems that what we might loosely term Baroque opera has a term that's hedged about for musicologists with all kinds of caveats. The term Baroque applied at the time more to or as much to art as to music, and it was used pejoratively in the 18th century. But in any case, there's a contemporary trend to treat Baroque opera under the Regietheater banner. So it's a very popular method of approach to opera of the 17th and 18th centuries. And for that reason, we thought it might be worth just saying a little bit about why that is, or speculating as to why that is, and whether it works or not, and how it works. Now, I have to say that myself, I have no particular axe to grind on this subject. I know that many of my colleagues who work on early opera do. Many of them, I suppose one could say, are purists. They dislike Regietheater for reasons of authenticity. They feel that it disrupts the message of the opera. So, for example, Heather MacDonald wrote in 2007 an essay in the New York Times, I think, called The Abduction of Opera, when she praised the legacy of beauty and nobility that she felt that Regietheater was sullying. She felt that we should instead have an unimpeded experience of an art form of unparalleled sublimity. And that's a common strain amongst critics of Regietheater. They feel that it interrupts their unimpeded experience of the work. And we'll come back to those ideas. I want to come back to those ideas at the end. But first, to address why I think this approach has become so popular for early opera. You'll often see in programs for directors, by directors of these kinds of productions, that the justification that there's some kind of connection between postmodern society and Baroque society. This is a bit of a fudge. It comes from the 1980s, when in fact the phrase on people's lips was not postmodern, but rather neo-Baroque in theatrical terms. So there was a big buzz around the creation of neo-Baroque productions which aimed for spectacle, extravagance, for a disjunction between what was going on stage and a sense of narrative. I think that particular association is both problematic and revealing, and I want to explain now why I think it's revealing. The kind of disjunctions and flamboyance that characterize Regietheater approaches to early opera, I think suggest not the unease of early opera, but rather our modern unease with early opera. That is to say, we're a very long way away from it, and we're a very long way from understanding its aesthetic. So we introduce these kinds of productions that revel in the sense of disjunction and ascribe that sense of disjunction to the 17th, 18th century, to the original operatic productions, and say, this is the way opera was experienced at the time, so it's okay for us to experience it that way too. That's a sleight of hand. It doesn't work. As I say, it's not that unease is expressed in the opera, it's rather our unease, a modern unease, with the opera, with our failure to understand it, I think. And the reason why the genre is fundamentally alien to us is because we have an expectation when we go to opera, as with other forms of drama, that we will see a coherent development of individual subjectivities, that it's a psychological drama that unfolds before us on the stage. But if I tell you that the word self, the notion of selfhood, as we apply it today, was something that they were talking about in the early 18th century and saying, what is this notion of self? Literally asking these questions. What is personality? Personality is an invention of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. So our fundamentally psychological ways of thinking about the construction of selfhood were only just beginning to form in the 18th century. We think of John Locke's essay concerning human understanding, when he says, he talks about the mind as a tabula rasa. He says, what happens if I am a sleepwalker and I kill someone while I'm sleepwalking? Am I responsible for that? So he asks the kinds of questions that become norms for lawyers to deal with in the 20th century, but in the 18th century, excuse me, they're only just beginning to think about these kinds of issues, and therefore we can't expect. Thanks, Barbara. We can't expect that some notion of psychology that wasn't present in the society should be present in the drama. And this unease and this problem that we have understanding the mindset of the 18th century crystallizes, I think, in the Da Capo aria. Now, we all think about the Da Capo aria as a conundrum. Why do you have the return of the A section? What is the point of that dramatically? And ever since directors, conductors have tried to revive 18th century opera, starting with Handel in the earlier part of the 20th century, they've developed different workarounds for that. Sometimes they cut the A section. They don't usually do that anymore under the kind of aim of authenticity. They keep the repeat of the A section. But what do they do during it? They they have all kinds of extraneous stuff going on in the background. Could we see the clip? Just as an example of this, from a production of Semele that I think is about 12 years old. And this is Susan Bickley. So this is the end of the A section, going into the B section. And now the return of the A section. Okay, Barbara, I think that's enough.
It's a great example.
Thanks. Yep, sure. Thank you. Thanks very much. So you get the idea, and I mean, it's amusing, and the audience are laughing at the time. But why do we do that? Why do that for the da capo? I think because we feel this unease about what it's there for dramatically. There are also other musical reasons. If we think about, frankly, what it's there for, what it was there for in the 18th century was to allow singers who had the talents of jazz musicians to improvise ornamentation. And the audience, the paying audience, would come back night after night. They'd have their season ticket to their box. What they came back for was not simply to hear the wonderful music, but to hear the singers improvise new ornamentation night after night. That's why we have the da capo for 18th century arias, and it continues long after its sell-by date into the late 18th century because audiences love to hear that ornamentation. Now, frankly, most modern singers have difficulty enough doing the ornamentation without improvising it as well. And that also perhaps may partly explain why there's a tendency to rush a lot of productions of opera of this period too. It doesn't allow too much time for singers to dwell on things they don't want to dwell on. But as I say, I think it's still more about this question of, to us, psychological credibility. That's why we turn these kinds of scenes into jokes, and it happens a lot. I mean, there can also be very powerful things done, but you very often see in these productions singers being upstaged by other members of the cast coming on and doing things in the background, or scene changes, things like that. And where that's a problem for Baroque opera, it's really interesting that directors or companies are now shifting interest to 18th century oratorio. And it's telling that we're shifting to that interest. It's telling because Handelian oratorio, while it still has da capo arias, is much more formally varied. So it has a lot of other kinds of forms available too. and forms that are more through-composed. It uses a lot more accompanied recitative, particularly in his later oratorios. These are the kinds of things that bring it a bit closer to 19th century opera and to our, not obviously entirely formally, but that sense of something being through-composed and developing dramatically over the course of the work is something that makes us feel more comfortable, makes us feel more at home. Also, the use of the chorus. The chorus was never on stage. The oratorios weren't staged in the 18th century, but of course choruses are an integral part of 19th century opera. And so again, we apply a kind of 19th century set of standards in looking at Handelian oratorio and saying, great, it doesn't have so many da capo arias, it has a big role for the chorus, let's put on the kinds of stagings that we see for 19th century opera. And so you get these, very often with the oratorios, a politicization of the story, an application of the story to contemporary political issues. I think that what I'd want to end with is saying that my real concern is not about Regietheater itself, but coming back to Peter's points about this shift from work to text and the transmutation of the role of the author from the composer and the original librettists, of course, to a modern director, that there is a little bit of a danger that instead of challenging us, as Levine's book suggested, instead of unsettling us, what these new productions do is keep us well and truly inside our comfort zone. They don't challenge us intellectually to think about how different our world is from the world of the 18th century. I don't say that uniformly, and of course they might challenge us in some ways and not in other ways. But I can think of a number of recent productions where the drama has been quite heavily edited to make it more appropriate to our kinds of standards. And to give one particular example from a couple of years ago, Glyndebourne's production by Frederick Wake-Walker of La Finta Giardiniera, an early Mozart opera buffa, and it is in the spirit of opera buffa of the mid-18th century. But what Wake-Walker's production did was cut quite extensively, rearrange material, and so he turned a comic opera into something much more like the Da Ponte operas, something that had this kind of thread of seriousness and pathos running through it, particularly in his alterations to the title character, the feigned gardener herself, Sandrina. And this was made more or less explicit in the program notes, which said, we at Glyndebourne have a mission to make audiences see La Finta Giardiniera as the beginning of Mozart's mature works, as just as worthy as the Da Ponte operas to be seen as these masterworks. So it's fiddling with history to make us fit Mozart into the molds that we want Mozart to be in as this great psychological dramatist, rather than seeing La Finta Giardiniera as it really was, a light-hearted early work in the spirit of opera buffa, which itself is a wonderful genre. So I think, and there are quite a few productions I've seen of Handel operas, of other Mozart operas, Die Entführung aus dem Serail, that adapt the ending, that cut the ending or alter it in some way to make it more profound and dramatically meaningful, as a way of saying this composer is a profound composer, telling us, offering us, as MacDonald said, a legacy of beauty and nobility, rather than saying, actually, this is a really wonderful composer, but you know he worked in his own way in his own time. we always want to shift it into something that speaks to us. I don't have a problem with operas speaking to us. I do have a problem with us pretending that it's exactly the way the author wanted it to be.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. I think we'll have an opportunity to thank our two speakers at the end of the session, when we'll have time for questions, I hope, and if we haven't got as much time as we would like, that will spill over into the round table. But I think from what you're saying, you might, one conclusion from that might be that a so-called more authentic, perhaps, presentation of some kind of an 18th century da capo aria, the performative text is much more about performance than, as it were, the 19th century, the sort of shibboleth of the 19th century idea of an opera as a sort of naturalistic drama.
Yes, but our problem is that we can't deliver on that musically. Or we do now have some singers who can improvise.
But it could well be that in this case an authentic historical production might be more unsettling than the ones we've had. Now, at this point, thank you, Suzanne. There will be a chance for the speakers to speak to each other as well after the next presentation, which leads me to introduce Barry Millington, who will be known to many of you, I'm sure. Brings us back into the world, into Professor Tielemans' world of Wagner, specifically, and Strauss to some extent as well, but for this afternoon, it's really Wagner. Barry, as many of you will know, is a great Wagnerian, has contributed to all of our knowledge of Wagner in a multitude of ways, actually. He's known as the chief music critic for the London Evening Standard. He's also founder editor of the Wagner Journal, and I think at this point I can just add a little plug for that there are some copies outside on the table. You may have seen them, and there is also a form for signing up if you would like a complimentary copy of the current edition.
Yes.
Is that,
yes.
Or
Yes.
the last one.
Recent.
So it's a terrific journal devoted to Wagner, who still continues, as we've seen from this last day and a half, still endlessly excites and interests us. He's also author of many books, including Richard Wagner, The Sorcerer of Bayreuth. He edited the Wagner Compendium, a wonderfully useful book that many of our students at Oxford have used endlessly. He also was a co-editor and translator of selected letters of Richard Wagner, and on. We could go on for a long time, but I think you realise that Barry is a well-known and much respected Wagnerian. We're very grateful to have him with us this afternoon. He's also a devotee of Regietheater, who is going to bring us round to be slightly more think more positively about it. Barry,
My best. Thank you. Thank you very much, Peter. Can you hear me? At the back? Good. Regietheater, director's theatre, or Eurotrash, depending on where you stand. They all describe pretty much the same phenomenon. In the case of Regietheater, and Peter's already offered us a very interesting working definition, the term and its application have shifted somewhat over the decades since it was first applied. But I think there's probably a broad consensus that today it involves some or all of the following: an element of directorial intervention in a production, a relocation of the action to a different period from that stipulated in the stage directions, a generally free hand with regard to the stage directions, an emphasis on the socio-political context of a work, relating it to contemporary issues, spluttering in the columns of the Daily Telegraph and Spectator. In recent decades, the tendency towards Regietheater has been driven by theoretical models from the literary field, such as deconstruction and post-dramatic theatre, of which more in a minute. But first, a little historical perspective. Regietheater is generally thought of as a phenomenon that gathered momentum in the 1970s and 80s, and indeed it did. Patrice Chéreau's production of The Ring at Bayreuth in 1976 was a landmark. And forgive me if I seem to refer unduly to Wagner productions. It's not only because this is my area of interest, but it's also because The Ring, the Ring that has often stimulated trailblazing productions through the decades. Now, Chéreau invoked a modern setting for the action, roughly the century framed by the history of the work to date, in other words, 1876 to 1976. And in a daring interplay of the work's mythological and contemporary planes, he unerringly captured the ideological thrust of Wagner's tetralogy, the degradation of love and humanity, humanity's finer instincts in a modern age dominated by industrial innovation, materialism, and profit-making. So the curtain went up on scene 1 of Das Rheingold, not on the traditional flowing waters of the Rhine, but on a hydroelectric dam, rusty and disused by the end of Götterdämmerung, as the Rhine, deprived of its gold, had dried up. Siegfried's forging of the sword was later to be assisted by a steam hammer. Now, the degree of naturalism Chéreau brought to the acting style was also revolutionary. With the stunningly attractive Peter Hoffmann and Janine Altmaier as the libidinous Volsung twins, the staging of the love scene of Die Walküre was more sexually charged than any scene before. Well, naturalistic acting of this kind, of course, is now commonplace, and audiences expect dramatic conviction as well as vocal expertise from the cast. But in 1976, it was comparatively rare on the operatic stage. I was there in 1976, and I well remember the fury this production generated in some quarters. Critics lambasted it. The Guardian critic was convinced that Chéreau, quote, could never even have heard the music before putting forward his dotty ideas, unquote. Actually, he couldn't have been more wrong. Chéreau had a profound knowledge of the work, as incidentally have all the truly great directors, despite the liberties they take. Well, there was jeering and whistling in the audience, fisticuffs in the auditorium, and breakfast rolls flew in the local Gasthäuser. An Aktionskreis für das Werk Richard Wagners. Get that? An action circle for the work of Richard Wagner. I think it's the jihadi wing of the Wagner Verband. Anyway, this Aktionskreis attempted by means of lobbying and financial blackmail to force the management to withdraw the production. A few years later, Chéreau's staging was being shown on primetime television, an act at a time, rather like Dallas, whose plot it resembles. The production was a huge hit, even in America, and now, of course, it's held up by conservative critics as a paragon, while the latest horror is excoriated. But it was ever thus. Wieland Wagner's productions at Bayreuth in the 1950s were reviled by many, but are now universally revered. And of course, these principles of Regietheater go back further still. Wieland was one of many directors influenced by the work of the Swiss designer Adolf Appia earlier in the century. Appia theorized about how best to realize the scenic dimension in Wagner's works, powered as they were by the inner musical life of the characters. His solution involved the abandonment of pictorialism and illusion in favor of an interiorized approach, suggestive, psychologically determined, with color and light accorded a primary role. In accordance with Wagner's own theories, if not with his compromised praxis, Appia focused on the figure of the singing actor, both her vocal expression and movements and gestures, and, crucially, on the poetic musical text. What the composer added to that text in the form of scenic instructions, argued Appia, was irrelevant. Well, this was a serious blow to the assumption that fidelity to Wagner's works necessitated a literal dedication to their stage directions. But it wasn't the first such blow. The designer Alfred Roller, already mentioned by Peter, was summoned to the Vienna Opera by Gustav Mahler. And together, they created groundbreaking productions of Tristan in 1903, Rheingold in 1905, and Die Walküre in 1907. Roller's method was essentially to use colored lighting to create vibrant stage spaces in order to stimulate the imagination of the audience. Roller certainly didn't feel constrained by Wagner's stage directions, and rightly so. They could more usefully be regarded as the attempt of the composer to evoke the kind of visual field he had in mind, working within the mode of naturalistic theatre, the theatre of illusion. Once that mode had passed into history, directors and designers had to take responsibility for creating these works anew, deploying whatever theatrical mode or visual language served the purpose. I see that Anna Stroll-Connect is in the audience, and she knows far more about Mahler and Roller than I do, and I hope she'll make some contribution later. Now, there's an apparent paradox that Mahler was cooperating in the recreation of Wagner's works in a style that Wagner himself could not have approved, because that particular revolution was not yet underway in Wagner's time, while yet adhering to the principle of Werktreue, fidelity to the work, which also became prevalent in the early decades of the century. Werktreue involved, among other things, the ruthless expunging of the cadenzas and florid improvisatory embellishments which had crept into Figaro, for example. In Götterdämmerung, the Norn scene had always been cut, but Mahler restored it, as well as many other cuts, making his performance last more than an hour longer than hitherto. He expected his singers all to know their parts thoroughly, and when Wagner was on the programme, he insisted that they read the writings of Wagner, which had certainly sorted out the keen ones from the others. But it has to be said that Mahler was occasionally more tolerant with guests than with his own singers. Nellie Melba, for example, was allowed to rise from the dead at the end of La Traviata and sing the mad scene from Lucia di Lammermoor. Werktreue, in other words, was a holy grail to be aspired to, but not at the expense of practicality or the greater good. And Mahler, like Roller, intuitively understood that the greater interests of Wagner's works, and indeed Fidelio and Don Giovanni, were better served by a dramaturgy that gave practitioners a degree of license to realize them with reference to the artistic modes and expectations of the day. And Wagner, we should remember, was not interested in a meticulous representation of reality, what he called arbitrary details of landscape scenery, nor in the historical realism of French grand opera. Indeed, Wagner, for all his dirigiste tendencies, recognized, as he told Röchel, that when an artist stands before his own work of art, it's just as capable of misleading him as it can mislead another person. Sometimes it takes the insights of another intelligence, Wagner goes on to say, to explain the work fully. Schiller put it this way: the real and express content that the poet puts into his work remains always finite. The possible content that he allows us to contribute is an infinite quantity. End of quote. In other words, we, the audience, have a role to play. Very interesting anticipation, this, of post-structuralist thinking, Barthes, Derrida, the death of the author, the role of the reader. Why should an author's own exegesis or understanding of his/her work be assumed to be the last word, excluding all other interpretations? They may have specially interesting insights, but a great work is always larger than a single interpretation. The French scholar Jean-Jacques Nati wrote perceptively about Werktreue in the context of the Chéreau ring, the idea of being faithful to the spirit rather than the letter. And Nati made the point that the importance of the eyewitness accounts of the first ring, set down by Heinrich Porges at the instigation of Wagner himself, is not that they provide a template for every director to follow. Voltron must pick up his spear in this bar, Brunhilde must walk 3 paces before sinking to her knees. Rather, they show that for Wagner it was the music that must always determine action and gesture. And so Chéreau, as a fellow creator, brought his own creative spirit to bear, seeking always to bring alive the drama of these works through the medium of the music. The work is eternally capable of bearing new truths, said Nati, decipherable according to period, place, and circumstance. So, having established the historical perspective, let's come back a little nearer to our own day. Chéreau was undoubtedly a major figure in the development of dramaturgy in the 20th century, but he wasn't the only one. Joachim Herz was doing something not dissimilar and equally innovatory in Leipzig between 1973 and 1976. Herz, as well as Harry Kupfer, Ruth Berghaus and others, was invited by Brian McMaster to work at Welsh National Opera in the late 1970s. And another East German, Götz Friedrich, came in 1974 to begin a new ring at Covent Garden. Panic ensued among the traditionalists. These East Germans, Marxists, were taking over our opera houses and now storming the citadel of the Royal Opera itself. It was a time for letters to the editor, for splenetic editorials in the Daily Telegraph. Well, the Marxists prevailed, I'm happy to say, and the following decades saw a transformation in the nature of opera production, not least with the heyday of the powerhouse at E&O, featuring the work of David Pountney, David Alden, and many others. And what's interesting, seeing this in a historical perspective, is the paradigm shift in dramaturgical principles. As always, yesterday's revolution becomes today's orthodoxy. So much of what caused apoplexy in the 1970s and 80s is now taken for granted. Updating of the action to the swinging 60s for La Traviata, relocation to a New York deli or an ocean liner for Così fan tutti, grappling with the issues of imperialism in Aida. The specifics can be debated in the foyer, in the media, at dinner parties, but the general drift towards directorial intervention is surely here to stay. Of course, there are still the YOY protests, not least in the letters pages of Opera magazine, where all the usual cliches are regularly trotted out. Why can't directors just follow the stage directions? I just think how stultifying that would be. Directors parading their egos. Why, incidentally, is a director's creative any less valid or more egoistic than a conductor's? Some of you this morning will have heard Strauss conducting the Prelude to Tristan. How subjective was that? How deeply subjective and revealing. So conductors are allowed to do it, but when it's directors, they're parading their egos. Let works speak for themselves is the other phrase trotted out. I mean, haven't these people yet grasped that an opera has no immanent meaning? It has to be recreated anew each time. Reading these columns is enough to make you lose the will to live. But I suppose there always has to be a rear guard, just as directors and other creative spirits have to be ahead of the curve. Regietheater, as I mentioned earlier, in general embodies principles that came to dominate literary theory from the 1960s, the chief of these being deconstruction. Deconstruction is perhaps the most important of the various post-structuralist theories of the era. In essence, it disassembles orthodox hierarchies. Roland Barthes' landmark essay, The Death of the Author, that Peter mentioned, 1968, specifically challenged the traditional assumption that the author is the sole origin of the text and the only authority for its interpretation. And post-structuralism generally emphasizes the unstable nature of signification, that is to say, the signs and symbols, in this case, words and music. Deconstruction, for which the primary source is Jacques Derrida's De la Grammatologie, 1967, likewise legitimizes a multiplicity of meanings and interpretations, encouraging the active participation of the reader or audience in arriving at its own. And I'd like to mention two further and not unrelated dramaturgical theories at this point. Meta-theatre, a term coined by Lionel Abel in 1963, and post-dramatic theatre, the theory of which was articulated most notably by Hans-Thies Lehmann. Now, both these principles, which would once have been loosely described as Brechtian, have become, or had become, firmly established not only in spoken theatre, but also in opera production by the turn of the 21st century. Meta-theatrical elements in a play, and the Greek word meta means beyond, are those in which a play comments on itself, or in which the theatrical constituents are highlighted. I mean, the play within a play in Shakespeare's Hamlet is a classic example. Now, Abel applied the principle to the self-reflective dramaturgies of Brecht, Pirandello, and Genet. And meta-theatrical techniques emphasizing the fact that we, the audience, are watching a piece of theatre are nowadays commonplace. Visible stage hands, prop moving, and on-stage video cameras are all indicative of meta-theatre. Post-dramatic theatre is more accurately described as a form of post-Brechtian theatre, and its chief features are as follows: narrative dissolution, deconstruction of plotline, replacement of high culture by more demotic forms, including debate and audience participation, an element of hostility towards a bourgeois audience, and a fragmenting of reality such that the totality is never grasped. The work of art itself is essentially less important here for its intrinsic value than as a trigger for audience self-interrogation. Paradoxically, post-dramatic theatre even returns to a form of modified naturalism, sometimes called hypernaturalism, involving a recharging of the banality and mediocrity of everyday life. Perhaps the best way of discussing post-dramatic theatre in opera is through a concrete example. And I've chosen The Ring by Frank Castorf, first seen at Bayreuth in 2013. And here I'm going to plunder shamelessly the extensive review I wrote for the Wagner Journal in the November 2015 issue, which incidentally is the one available outside and available on request. Drawing on the deconstructive principles of post-dramatic theatre, Castorf's production aims to break the work down to its constitutive elements, putting it back together again in the hope of revealing new truths. Here's a brief summary. Das Rheingold is set at the Golden Motel on Route 66, probably in Texas in the 1960s, while the theme of oil as the black gold emerges clearly from the setting of Die Walküre in the oil fields of Baku, Azerbaijan, against the background of the early 20th century oil boom there. Siegfried takes the action to post-war Europe with a parody of the Mount Rushmore National Memorial featuring 4 communist leaders, Marx, Lenin, Stalin and Mao, and the Neidhöhler forest relocated to Berlin-Alexanderplatz during the Cold War. By Götterdämmerung, the Giebischung family have put their oil to good use in a plastics factory with a fruit and veg store and a kebab joint adjoining. The set turns to reveal the New York Stock Exchange, in which they also, of course, have extensive interests. Video projections generated in real time by visible camera operators, meta theatre strikes again, offer either revealing close-ups from different angles or caustic commentary on the action. Now, central to Castorf's approach is irony. He constantly offsets surface appearances with pungent counter-criticism. So the nobility of the Valhalla music is subverted by the cavorting of Wotan in bed with Freya as well as Fricka. The sublimity of the big love duets or the scene for Wotan and Brunhilde in Walküre is counterpointed by images of sordidity, gross materialism, and amoral manoeuvring. During Act 1 of Die Walküre, no fewer than 3 liaisons are depicted more or less simultaneously. The idealized one of Siegmund and Sieglinde, the patriarchal, brutal one of Hunding and Sieglinde, and one of many less than salubrious affairs in which the libidinous Wotan indulges. Now this, I think, all works quite well, while in Siegfried the fertility of theatrical dimension is quite breathtaking. The background to Siegfried's upbringing is elaborated with astonishing socio-psychological insight. This is a young man destined to grow up disturbed and damaged. It was a hugely thought-provoking Siegfried, and the Götterdämmerung was also powerful. But we also need to tackle head-on the critical question about Castorf's production, whether or not it satisfies emotionally as well as intellectually, with music and drama interlocking to maximum effect. And the fact is that the post-dramatic project, deploying its merciless weapon of irony, is committed to undermining categories such as idealism, heroism, nobility, and sublimity, all categories which might be thought to be fairly central to the Wagnerian music drama. That's not to say, of course, that those categories should never be undermined. On the contrary, some of the finest productions of recent years have done exactly that, with extraordinary results. There would appear, however, to be a fundamental disjunction between the Wagnerian music drama and post-dramatic theatre, and I'm not convinced it can be resolved. Post-dramatic theatre, it has to be emphasised, is the most extreme of the dramaturgical approaches currently being essayed in opera houses around the world. Other productions commonly draw on more general deconstructive techniques. Some people complained about the Carmen by Calixto Bieito at ENO, first seen in 2012 and revived last year. Some of you may have seen it. True, it was stripped of all the elements that for many define Carmen. There's no tavern, no bull ring, and no pelvic thrusting gypsy. But what Bieito's updated staging does instead is to explore the dark underbelly of sexual passion with a visceral savagery. The soldiers, abused by their thuggish officers, treat their womenfolk with comparably crass macho aggression. Men, women, and children in this late 1970s society are all victims of a tawdry, brutal culture where mindless violence, child prostitution, and institutional corruption are rife. Another memorable Bieito production at ENO recently was Verdi's Force of Destiny. Now, traditionally, it's the uncoiling spring of inexorable fate that's the motor of this work. But for Bieito, the tragedy that unfolds is the byproduct of a fanatical, patriarchal society engaged in a brutal civil war. So the Rataplan chorus is no mere crowd-pleasing call to arms, but invokes the reality of war with a chilling execution of reluctant conscripts. Meanwhile, over at Covent Garden, Caspar Holton's Eugene Onegin was first seen in 2013 and recently revived. Pushkin's tale is all about memory, regret, and the agony of missed opportunities. And Holton brilliantly dramatizes those states of mind by giving both Tatiana and Onegin a double. When Tatiana writes her famous letter to Onegin, we see a young virginal girl writhing with sensual passion, watched by her sadder, wiser, and older self. These alter egos offer the pair a history and allow us to respond emotionally to past, present, and future simultaneously. Of course, not every Regietheater production is equally successful, and I've indicated my reservations about the Kastorf ring. Some may resort to cliches, others may not work for other reasons, but surely the occasional failure is worth the risk. I'm always amused, incidentally, by the criticism that Regietheater is riddled with cliché, when this would seem to me to be a more accurate description of the kind of plodding naturalistic productions served up for centuries, all looking pretty much the same and without two ideas to rub together. But I want to end by discussing a production that is quintessentially Regietheater, which deploys all the features characteristic of Regietheater that I listed at the beginning: directorial intervention, relocation of the action to a different period, a free hand with regard to the stage directions, and an emphasis on the socio-political context of the work, relating it to contemporary issues. And it's the production of Parsifal by Stefan Herrheim, first seen at Bayreuth in 2008. And it is, in my opinion, one of the finest productions of any Wagner work in recent decades. In a minute, I'm going to play an extract from it. But first, a brief introduction. What makes this production of Parsifal so important and so enthralling for me is that it interrogates the problematic history of the work, and indeed of German idealism, but it emerges with something to celebrate. Rather than evading the difficult issues, as some would like to do, Herrheim confronts and triumphs over them. Paradoxically, the agent of redemption turns out to be the Wagnerian work of art itself. For Herrheim's concept is a brilliant interweaving of the production history of Parsifal from 1882 with the path of German history over the same period. Opening inside Wahnfried, with the boy Parsifal observing the death of his mother Herzeleide, the first act is set against the social background of the 19th century Germany. The revelation of the Grail comes at an ill-timed moment of history, and we see, in an imaginative meshing of stage action with historical film footage, the Grail Knights marching off at the end of the act to join Kaiser Wilhelm's troops. Meanwhile, the bed that has occupied centre stage for the entire act had been occupied variously, sometimes simultaneously, by Herzeleida, Parsifal as a boy, Parsifal as a young man, Amfortas, resembling Christ, and finally even Gurnemanz, covering himself with blankets at the end of the act as though retreating from the world. In the second act, the self-castrated Klingsor, wearing fishnet tights, also turns up in the bed, while Kundry, and we're in the Weimar Republic by now, is dressed in cabaret-style top hat and tails. The omnipresent article of furniture is thus a hotbed of concupiscence, mother-longing, and transgender display. Heike Scheele's sets incorporate at different times Wahnfried, both interior and exterior, including Wagner's Grave, the Bayreuth Festspielhaus, the mise-en-scène of the 1882 production with the Siena Cathedral pillars, the Ravello-inspired Magic Garden, and so forth, and more besides. A series of theatrical coups take the breath away. In the final act, a proscenium arch on stage, an exact replica of those in the Festspielhaus, underlines the fact that what we're observing is a performance on the stage at Bayreuth. Stage lights come on for the Good Friday music, and at the end of the act, we, the audience, are reflected in a giant mirror on stage. Theatre and reality are thus conjoined, the implication being that Parsifal itself can offer the longed-for redemption. The politicians pontificating in the Bonn Bundestag in the final act have no solution. Only we, human beings who have learned the twin lessons of Parsifal, compassion, and its reverse, racial hatred, can bring about a better future. And it's surely this uplifting message, combined with quite extraordinary stagecraft, that has won so many admirers for this particular example of Regietheater. So with Barbara's help, I'm going to play this extract. It lasts about 8 minutes, and what you'll see, just to remind you of what I said about the first act. First of all, you'll see Amfortas in white as a Christ-like figure, and then the Grail Knights becoming German soldiers of the Wilhelmine period with these helmets Professor Thielmann mentioned this morning. And at this point, the wafer of bread at the communion service becomes the soldiers' sandwiches or other rations. And you'll see the backdrop of the film with the soldiers mobilizing for war. And there's a marvelous point at which the soldiers on the stage clap each other on the back as they're going off to war. And at this point, their procession merges with the film footage that you see from behind, this merging of what's on stage with historical footage. It's a great moment. The bay window at the back is the window from Wahnfried, as seen at the beginning of the production, though it's also set in a space that approximates Siena Cathedral, as required by Wagner. And the Wahnfried interior becomes clearer at the very end of the clip, when Amfortas disappears and the young Parsifal emerges instead in the Wahnfried bedroom, where his mother died at the beginning of the act. And with him, you'll see Gurnemanz, in the guise of his father, Parsifal's father, as it were, berating him for his indifference to the suffering of Amfortas.
Okay.
So here's a clip from Act 1 of Parsifal and Stefan Herrheim's production at Bayreuth.
Barry, thank you very much. It is quite an extraordinary production. It's fair to say that it's already spawned at least 2 monographs, I think I'm right in saying,
Yes.
both of which I possess. The tragedy is that this will never be available on public DVD.
And you've written about it as well, Peter.
I've written about it as well. It's absolutely staggering. So if I appear to be on the anti-Regietheater side of the argument, let me say I found this simply one of the most staggering theatrical productions of anything I've ever seen. I think it also developed each year. He added things. Certainly, I remember the last time when the front of the Proscenium March also lifted, and you saw the whole of the Yukovsky Siena Dome, which I don't remember the other time. Anyway, enough of that. Thank you very much to both of our speakers. We've got about 7 minutes left. Now, Professor Thielemann was alluding to some of the issues that we've been talking about this very morning, and might want to respond briefly now, or could do that in the session to follow after tea, or we might have some questions. So, Professor Thielemann, do you feel moved to say anything at the moment about that, or would you like to? We'll just see.
I think we heard a wonderful Bravo film.
Yeah, terrific. Yeah. So, thank you to both the speakers. Thank you to Suzanne and Barry.